United States is coming to an end. What America is definitely is a country, a textbook case of a country on the threshold of civil war. America is the most diverse country in the world by a long measure, and if its unity were to fracture, it would fracture into a million little pieces. I genuinely don't see how they're going to escape. However, if anyone could do it, it's them. That would be my note of hope.
It was more than 3 years ago now, but the United States is still not over it. After the last presidential election, thousands of protesters gathered in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, and stormed the Capitol building, trying to prevent the transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. The lawmakers inside the building, even those loyal to Trump, huddled, fearing for their lives. The United States had never seen anything like it. Other countries have, they've seen worse, and the United States fears that worse may be ahead for the USA as well. Journalists are writing about more and more political violence, about increasingly violent political rhetoric. Historians, political scientists are studying the path that other countries have taken towards civil war, fearing that the United States is going in the very same direction. Hollywood has its take, and you can see Civil War, the movie. Many Americans are wondering what is going to happen, but increasingly they're becoming afraid of what author Stephen Marsh calls the next Civil War. It's not the work of a political scientist, it's the work of a novelist and a journalist, and he mixes genres. It's part fact, part fiction, but it's an extremely troubling possibility. If you have some thoughts, share them in the chat. We want to hear from you. Stephen Marsh is with us, and I have to tell everyone, the opening paragraph of your book hits you on the head like a brick. Essentially what you say, I'm paraphrasing here, is civil war in the United States is a certainty. It is going to happen. It's not only going to tear apart the United States, it's going to affect, I think in your phrase, every government, every business, every individual on earth. That is strong stuff. Do you really believe it, or are you just trying to frighten us and get the pages turning?
Well, I think what I actually said is that the United States is coming to an end, which is a slightly different contention than civil war. However, I would say that, while nothing is inevitable, and I think people who make really hardcore predictions, I don't consider myself in this book making hardcore predictions. But what America is definitely is a country, a textbook case of a country on the threshold of civil war. The models, the best available models, political science models, environmental models, military models, show that it is heading in that direction. And unless steps are taken to avoid it, it is going that way. Political violence is rising. The rhetoric of the acceptance of political violence is widening. Nothing is certain, but unless steps are taken, that is the direction it's going.
Now, I think we should share with everyone something crucial about your book, which is it's not fiction and it's not nonfiction. It's a hybrid. It's a mixture of the two. It's all kinds of facts, all kinds of speculation, but the facts are true and they're extremely troubling. So tell me, how do you think this is going to unfold? What's going to happen?
Well, I don't think anyone knows how exactly it's going to unfold, but I don't think the question of what a civil war will look like is any more a question of speculation. January 6th is already there. You already have judges flying American flags upside down. You already have, partisans at war in the streets. You already have sizable, the level of political violence that the United States is in already qualifies it as civil strife. So I think, what I did in these scenarios is kind of put meat on the bones of what the models are saying, and I interviewed about 200 people for this book. I got the best available models. I went and talked to all the partisans, far right people, white power people, far left people at Chaz, and so on. The scenarios there are really to sort of give a picture of what it would look like. But I don't think you really need to imagine it anymore. It's sort of it's not really imminent anymore. It's kind of incipient. You can open the news and see what a civil war in America would look like.
Again, this is really strong stuff. And some people are tying it to America's current political situation, the impasse.
Well, no, I mean, the thing that when I wrote this book, which I started in 2018, the year that I was thinking about for like when the Civil War would come was 2040. That's when America becomes a majority minority country, and a lot of other factors come into play at that time. It just seems to be much more accelerated than anyone thought. I would say than any of the expert class that I spoke to. I mean, you're already in a situation where 2020 and 2016 were both considered by large portions of the American public to be illegitimate elections. And winners or losers are less important for democracy than everyone agreeing on who won, right? And that's already gone in a certain sense. I mean, that is how democracies crumble. It's not necessarily one person getting into power. It's when the public doesn't believe the process anymore. And of course, we've seen the same hollowing out with the legal system, right? Which is has gone in my generation from a essentially nonpartisan arbiter of the Constitution to political hack, right? That too is a textbook case of what happened in countries like Chile, and it went before their civil war, and it happens all over smaller countries both in Europe and in Africa, right? So, and I do not think the United States is invulnerable from these pressures. In fact, we're seeing that it isn't.
We're using the word war. What do you mean? What is it going to look like? I mean, there are countries
Well,
around the
yeah,
world, including the United States, that have endured acts of terrorism. There are countries around the world
yeah.
that have endured insurgencies. And then there are countries around the world that have endured full-scale classic civil war, men on two sides wearing different colored uniforms or no uniforms at all, but basically one side fighting from one part of the country to defeat another side fighting from another part of the country. What would you expect in the United States?
Well, I mean, the vision that I have, PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, which is sort of the leading body on studying civil wars, their threshold for civil wars, 1,000 combatant deaths a year. I'm not sure how meaningful that is in the United States, just because it's so huge and has such a vast population and a vast geography. But we're not talking about like the movie Civil War or the first Civil War in the United States, where you have like encamped armies from various states going to war. Like, that's not what happens in the 21st century. What we're talking about is attempts to impose order and chaos rising up. And the problem is that every attempt to impose order creates more chaos, right? So the best case scenario would be like the Troubles in Ireland, and the worst case scenario would be like Syria. We're not talking about war in the sense of encamped armies. We are talking about insurgency, counterinsurgency, the struggle to impose order that then leads to chaos. That's what I mean. That's very much what I mean by war in this book. Not Texas going to war against the federal government. That's just not really on the cards.
So who would the insurgents be?
Well, they'd be a collection of radicals that would be splintered off into hundreds of groups. I mean, already, if you try to analyze the far right in the United States right now, it is a fractured group of maybe as many as 50 violent groups that are very, very hard to pin down. You've got far right people. And some of these groups, like accelerationist groups, already have been found with nuclear materials, preparing for dirty bombs. They're very significant. You have sovereign citizens, which are, by the estimate of the FBI, somewhere around 600,000 people, do not accept the legal status of the United States. You have far right groups of various other kinds. And then, of course, you have far left groups who are much less powerful, not necessarily because they're any less hate filled, but because they tend to destroy themselves before they can actually take military action. So it would be, I mean, America is the most diverse country in the world by a long measure. And if its unity were to fracture, it would fracture into a million little pieces, right? By race, by religion, by political affiliations, by local affiliations, it would be a horrific mess of masses of shards of politics.
You're not the first person to say this, and the authorities are not a whole lot stupider than anyone else. The United States has an enormous national security apparatus. It has an enormous military. It has state police forces. It has a national police force and the FBI. Is Washington ready for the kinds of trouble you're describing?
Well, I have to say, Joe Biden deserves some credit, and the FBI started taking domestic terrorism extremely seriously, and it's a very thorny problem because you need to deal with the fact that you can't really use the terrorist watch list as you could with Islamic terrorism because the police departments are so riddled with white power people that essentially you're warning the white power groups by putting them on a terrorist watch list. So they've taken some pretty effective steps. But to be very clear, like the U.S. military is the best in the world, and any insurgent group would be nothing compared to them. I mean, I wanted in the book to have a battle scene, right? And every military figure that I spoke to was like, "There's no battle for the Marines. Like the Marines against some little group with AR-15s is nothing." But that's really not the point. I mean, the United States couldn't stop the insurgency in Afghanistan, and some of them were using flintlock rifles that they'd taken from British soldiers in 1870. Like, it's not a question of military superiority being able to end civil conflict. We've seen that that's not, America has learned that lesson brutally over the past 70 years multiple times, right? That like the attempt to militarily overwhelm an insurgency is actually counterproductive. Right. And in the case of the United States, a freedom loving people, if there ever were one, a people who will not be told what to do, setting up things like Alaska gates in cities. I mean, it just would create way more problems than any military could solve. So, there is absolutely military dominance from the federal government, but that doesn't mean that they would win. I mean, if you read Why We Lost about Afghanistan, right, like America doesn't really lose any battles; they just lose the war, right? And that's the nature of counterinsurgency. It's a game that you cannot. The only way to win is not to play, but of course, you're not always given that choice by history.
This is incredibly serious, incredibly frightening stuff. Do you really think it's going to happen?
Look, I think every model that we have points in this direction. I would also say that if there were one country that could escape this, it would be the United States. It is the country of reinvention. It is the country of personal reinvention. It's the country of political reinvention. It has at various times in its history come to a movement of practical politics that has been a beacon to the rest of the world. But I will tell you this: it's not going to work itself out. This is not like the '60s where it's like we're going to have all this violence and then it's going to be quaaludes and key parties and disco and everything will be fine. This requires an active solution. And I would say that I see no evidence from either party of an attempt to actually even take their foot off the gas of the hatred and loathing that is building in the country. So, Americans are absolutely capable of solving this, but the question is, will they?
What about the rest of the world? Watching this conversation, watching the drama and the tension and the conflict in the United States unfold, how is the rest of the world affected by this?
Well, I mean, massively. Like Germany and Japan are about to rearm massively. Right. Like, and that will change the nature of those countries. That will change their entire relationship to their nationhood. And it is something that is a completely different way of life. They are going to be in a different frame of life than they have been in since the end of the Second World War. Right. They are going to have militaries with real power again. And the political consequences of that for those countries are severe. That's going to happen no matter, we've all realized, like the rest of the world has woken up and America is no longer Big Brother who's going to take care of us all. For a country like Canada, where I'm from, where we're just like massively vulnerable, it's like 70% of our trade. And, suddenly the Americans can elect Trump and he can declare us a national enemy. And we have to start thinking through what that means. It's much more of a pure disaster. Right. So I think, everyone, of course, complained bitterly about the American empire when it was in existence. But I do believe that we'll miss it when it's gone. I do believe that. And I say that as a foreigner.
Is there a note of optimism to end this conversation? Or are we just all just going to be appropriately troubled by all the things you've said?
We're talking about Americans. When Americans are involved, there is always a cause for hope. They have pulled things out of the fire a lot, and they have come to true practical politics, i.e., not politics worshiping kings and gods, but of actual trying to help people in their lives more than any other country. But I find it. don't have a lot of hope because what's required is essentially a new constitution, and Americans are, they worship their constitution, which is broken. Um, and I genuinely don't see how they're going to escape. However, if anyone can do it, it's them. That would be my note of hope.
Stephen Marsh, thanks very much for this.